Is the hope for peace over in Ukraine? The Germans and Russians sound off. The late October leak of the West approaching Ukraine to start negotiations to end the war gave some hope that peace talks could start. The next 2 weeks did see progress, with each side making some proposals of what peace could look like. And though no breakthroughs came, NATO and the Russians did not shut the door on peace talks. The Ukrainians were the only party to say no to peace talks until Russia left Ukrainian territory, including the land taken in 2014. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz seemed to fully back the Ukrainian demands. This week, both the Germans and the Russians made statements that seemed to dim the prospect for peace. The German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, published a report that stated that Russia is the greatest threat to the West. As a result, NATO needs to pursue a rapid military buildup with the goal of being able to wage a war with Russia in the next 5 to 9 years. They stated that once fighting ends in Ukraine, the badly mauled Russian army will need about 6 to 10 years to reconstitute itself and to continue its open-ended war in Ukraine and beyond. NATO needs to be ahead of the Russians by 1 year to give it time to reposition its forces further east to meet the Russian threat. The DGAP statement was interesting in that it seems to indicate that the Ukrainians will lose the war and NATO needs to be prepared for the next war that is to come. Though they do not directly state it, it is implied because the entire premise of NATO needs to build up before Russia recovers indicates they assume no lasting peace or Ukraine's long-term security requirements will be addressed. It also does not state the Ukrainians are defeated, but the war turns into a low-intensity conflict, probably like what was occurring in the Donbass between 2014 and 2022. This week, the Russian ambassador at large, Rodion Mrazhnik, stated that peace talks were not imminent. Mrazhnik told reporters that peace will not occur with the current Ukrainian regime in place, and coexistence with Moscow is not possible. He stated that Russia will continue its special military operation indefinitely until Ukraine is defeated and demilitarized, and this is achievable because NATO will lose interest in supporting Ukraine indefinitely. Mrazhnik's statements is that Russia's war goals are regime change and the demilitarization of Ukraine, though he did leave the option open that if regime change occurs, there could be an opening for peace. The Russian position mirrors the Ukrainians' position, is that Zelensky will not talk peace with the Russians. He will talk peace with the Russians, but will not with Putin. The Russians stated they will not negotiate with Zelensky. These cannot be called steps in the right direction for peace, even though most proponents for peace talks admit that most likely will not start until 2024 and after the expected Russian winter offensive. The DGAP, for their part, do not hold any official position in Germany, NATO, or the EU, so what they are proposing is not a policy position. This is not to say that their assumptions are wrong, because without a negotiated peace, the Ukrainians will not be able to win the war in the long run without direct NATO involvement. NATO has stated they would not involve its troops in Ukraine at this time, so DGAP's argument makes sense. NATO will not get directly involved in the current conflict. Some form of Ukrainian defeat will occur, and an emboldened Russia will rebuild and continue its aggressive policy. NATO will have to be ready to meet the Russians and show the resolve to fight them when the fight occurs. DGAP and Mrazhnik are in the same conclusion, in that Ukraine's position has already passed the tipping point and cannot win. The Russians are indicating that they have the stronger position to dictate terms on the Ukrainians or to continue the war and slowly crush Ukraine. DGAP concedes this point in that NATO needs to look beyond the current war and be ready to actually fight the next war with Russia. If peace is going to be sought, it needs to be pressed and pressed soon.